Iran reverses course, relocks Hormuz after 24 hours. Donald Trump responds. U.S. forces fire on Iranian vessel evading blockade. Iran maintains combat posture amid ongoing talks. $240 million USISR drone operates over Cuba, signaling potential strike access. Less than 24 hours after announcing the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran abruptly reversed course, reimposing tight restrictions in direct response to U.S. sanctions and port limitations. Tehran declared a full restoration of authority, warning that as long as Washington maintains pressure, Hormuz will not return to normal operations. This increasingly resembles open confrontation rather than tactical maneuvering. On the water, escalation was immediate. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps units fired warning shots at tankers, forcing multiple vessels to turn back, including a 2 million-barrel supertanker. Energy flows are once again being disrupted. Washington has not backed down. United States Central Command, CENTCOM, confirmed continued enforcement of the blockade, redirecting over 20 vessels while sustaining naval presence in the region. Following the collapse of talks in Islamabad, the conflict has shifted from indirect pressure to direct regulation of maritime transit, turning Hormuz into a strategic flashpoint. Diplomatic space is narrowing fast. With blockade meeting blockade, Hormuz is no longer just a shipping lane. It is now a central lever in an escalating confrontation with no clear off-ramp. Amid tightening U.S. enforcement on Iranian ports, on April 19th, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that an Iranian cargo vessel failed to comply with warnings and was disabled by U.S. naval fire targeting its engine compartment, forcing it to halt. U.S. forces have since secured the vessel and are conducting a full cargo inspection. In a Truth Social post, Trump said the guided missile destroyer USS Spruance, DDG-111, intercepted the Iran-flagged vessel Tuska in the Gulf of Oman and issued repeated warnings to stop. After the crew failed to comply, U.S. forces used precision fire to disable the engine compartment, leaving the vessel inoperable. U.S. Marines then boarded and secured the ship, which had previously been designated under U.S. Treasury sanctions, while cargo inspections began. The incident comes as the U.S. blockade campaign, launched following the collapse of talks in Islamabad, has transitioned into direct enforcement on the water. Washington has since ordered a comprehensive shutdown of Iranian ports to intensify pressure on Tehran. Speaking at the White House on April 16th, Trump stated the measures had effectively disrupted the majority of Iran's economic activity, exceeding expectations. "I believe we've made significant progress," Donald Trump said, stressing that the blockade has severely constrained Iran's ability to sustain normal commercial operations. That political message was quickly reinforced by operational updates from CENTCOM. CENTCOM later released details of a 6-hour standoff with the vessel Tuska, confirming that the use of force was deemed necessary to compel it to stop. CENTCOM has continued to provide operational updates via X. In a Sunday statement, it reported that a helicopter was launched from the destroyer USS Pinckney, DDG-91, to patrol the area and support oversight of shipping lanes into and out of Iranian ports. A day earlier, CENTCOM also confirmed that in the Arabian Sea, U.S. sailors and Marines were conducting blockade operations aboard the amphibious dock landing ship USS Rushmore LSD-47. CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper stated on April 17th that more than 10,000 personnel, over 100 aircraft, and dozens of warships are now committed to the large-scale blockade campaign. "We have the resources and capability to sustain this operation for as long as required," he emphasized. Iran has condemned the move, arguing that the U.S. imposed blockade violates the existing ceasefire framework between the two sides. Even as tensions escalate at sea, both sides are still attempting to preserve a diplomatic track, albeit under increasing strain. Iran signals combat readiness while keeping talks with the U.S. active. Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, said on Saturday, April 18th, that Tehran remains prepared for military confrontation with the United States if diplomacy fails. He emphasized that entering negotiations does not equate to reduced readiness, noting that while civilians signal resolve on the streets, Iran's armed forces remain at a high state of operational alert. In parallel, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps confirmed it will sustain and tighten control over the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point handling roughly 1/5 of global oil flows. As long as Washington maintains its naval blockade of Iranian ports, Tehran will continue strict oversight of maritime traffic in the area. On the U.S. side, President Donald Trump said on Sunday that an American delegation is expected to arrive in Pakistan on Monday night for the next round of talks, though Tehran has not confirmed. He also warned that absent an agreement, Washington could move to strike Iran's energy and transportation infrastructure. It remains unclear whether the parties have shifted positions on the core issues that derailed previous talks, namely Iran's uranium enrichment program, its regional proxy network, and control of the Strait of Hormuz. The temporary U.S.-Iran ceasefire is set to expire on Wednesday, April 22nd, while a separate 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, announced by Washington, remains in effect. Halibaf also stated that Hormuz will remain restricted for now due to the impact of U.S. blockade measures. He stressed that Iran will not accept a scenario in which other nations operate freely while it remains constrained, warning that maritime traffic will continue to face tight control unless restrictions are lifted. Meanwhile, a senior commander from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps disclosed that Iran is accelerating rearmament during the ceasefire, according to Tasnim news agency. Majid Musavi said upgrades and munitions replenishment for missile and UAV systems are now proceeding at a pace exceeding pre-conflict levels. On Sunday, U.S. President Donald Trump accused Tehran of violating ceasefire terms in the Strait of Hormuz, stating on Truth Social that Iranian forces fired on a French vessel, an action he called unacceptable and contrary to prior commitments. Trump said Washington has put forward what he described as a fair and reasonable deal and expects Iran to accept. He warned, however, that if Tehran refuses, the United States could move to strike Iran's power grid and transportation infrastructure. 240 million USISR drone over Cuba signals expanded strategic control. What is unfolding may be part of a broader architecture, an expanding strategy linking global energy choke points into a unified strategic oversight network. The clearest signal is the emergence of high-end ISR platforms operating beyond the Middle East. In recent days, a U.S. Navy MQ-4C Triton, valued at roughly $200 to $240 million, has been detected near Cuban airspace, conducting wide-area surveillance over key Caribbean shipping corridors. It goes beyond routine monitoring. It is pre-positioning for contingency operations. From Venezuela to Hormuz to Malacca, Washington is progressively tightening oversight of strategic energy routes, particularly in the context of competition with China. The deployment over Cuba suggests the operational map is expanding into a fourth axis of strategic pressure. The MQ-4C is a high-altitude, long-endurance ISR platform capable of remaining airborne for over 24 hours at altitudes exceeding 50,000 feet, delivering real-time maritime domain awareness across vast areas. Unarmed but highly capable, it functions as a force multiplier, tracking, classifying, and mapping naval activity at scale. Flight tracking data indicates repeated sweep patterns across the Caribbean, particularly near Cuba, covering corridors that connect the Atlantic to critical shipping routes. This is no longer point surveillance, but full-spectrum maritime domain control. But Hormuz may be only the Middle Eastern expression of a broader U.S. strategy now extending into the Caribbean and beyond. The most telling detail is that the flight path was publicly visible. This was likely intentional. When a strategic ISR platform like the MQ-4C Triton appears in the open, it is not just collecting data, it is signaling deterrence. The United States is present, watching, and capable of intervening at will. Taken in context, this was not a routine reconnaissance sortie. It fits into a broader control architecture, where information itself becomes an operational tool to shape and regulate strategic flows. This appears to be a deliberate signal directed at Beijing. Open-source tracking showing the drone's orbit near Cuba was not accidental. It was a calculated "we are watching" message tied to U.S. pressure on global energy routes linked to China. Flight patterns indicate the MQ-4C likely monitored key Caribbean corridors, including routes connecting the Panama Canal to the Atlantic, critical nodes in energy transit networks. Its repeated sweep patterns point to full area control, not point surveillance. At Havana, the signal becomes clearer. Washington appears to be executing a fourth move in a broader energy strategy linking Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, the Strait of Malacca, and China, aimed at constraining Beijing's oil supply lines. Moreover, the MQ-4C Triton's orbit suggests it likely surveilled not just Cuban airspace, but also key Caribbean corridors, including the Windward Passage and Yucatan Channel, critical transit routes linking the Atlantic to global energy flows. The strategic value here is not measured in barrels of oil, but in control. Since Washington disrupted Venezuela-China oil flows earlier this year, Beijing has been forced to compensate. Chinese crude imports from Russia surged by roughly 40.9% year-over-year in January-February, underscoring a rapid pivot under pressure. At the same time, U.S. pressure around the Strait of Hormuz has intermittently affected a significant portion of China's seaborne oil supply, estimated between 40% and 45%. The disruption is not absolute, but it is enough to strain logistics, raise costs, and compress strategic flexibility. Even as flows partially resume following regional ceasefire arrangements, U.S. naval forces are expected to maintain a gatekeeper role in the Gulf of Oman, retaining the ability to regulate access when required. This aligns with a broader pattern. Washington's second move targets Hormuz. The third extends into Southeast Asia, where deepening defense ties with Indonesia reinforce surveillance over the Strait of Malacca, a route carrying roughly 80% of China's seaborne crude imports. Taken together, these moves are not isolated actions. They form a layered strategic architecture: Venezuela, Hormuz, Malacca, and now the Caribbean, designed to apply sustained pressure on China's energy lifelines across multiple axes. This alignment would give Washington expanded visibility over the Strait of Malacca, and, by extension, increased leverage along China's eastern maritime approaches. The corridor carries roughly 80% of China's seaborne crude imports, making it one of Beijing's most critical vulnerabilities. However, the strategic equation is more complex than simple supply disruption. China maintains diversified energy inputs, including overland pipelines from Russia, Central Asia, and Pakistan, alongside multiple crude sources. The issue is not access, but exposure. With the United States exerting pressure across key maritime choke points, Beijing is forced to adapt, either by rerouting supply chains or leveraging diplomatic and economic countermeasures. Following U.S. disruption of Venezuela-linked flows, China's increased engagement with Cuba signaled a recalibration of its external energy posture. In January, China's foreign ministry publicly criticized U.S. actions around Cuba, later moving to supply fuel to the island, effectively reinforcing its foothold in the Caribbean. This suggests a counter-pressure strategy. If Washington expands control, Beijing responds by securing alternative nodes. From a strategic standpoint, Cuba represents a fourth axis in this evolving contest. Control over the Caribbean is not just about regional influence. It enables oversight of critical maritime corridors linking the Atlantic to global trade routes. Dominance in this space would allow the United States to constrain external penetration, particularly by China's so-called shadow fleet, and expand surveillance coverage along its southern maritime approaches, including areas near Florida. In operational terms, this is no longer about isolated choke points. It is about building a layered control grid where maritime access, energy flows, and surveillance dominance converge into a single strategic framework. "I can do whatever I want with it," US President Donald Trump said in March. One analyst concluded he is close to proving that point. The blockade has placed Cuba under sustained pressure, while China retains limited influence. That dynamic suggests the mission set of the MQ-4C Triton may expand beyond ISR into indirect support roles, enhancing monitoring, targeting, and coordination for broader operational activities. From the reimposition of control over the Strait of Hormuz to the seizure of the Tuska, to the deployment of a $240 million ISR platform over Cuba, What is emerging is a multi-layered containment strategy without precedent. The logic is not in isolated engagements, but in systemic disruption. The objective is to neutralize the economic lifeblood of strategic competitors through energy dominance. By positioning control across 4 critical choke points, Venezuela, Hormuz, Malacca, and Cuba, Washington is effectively transforming maritime corridors into geopolitical valves capable of regulating global energy flows at will. This is not solely about pressuring Tehran or Havana. The end state targets Beijing, constraining China's oil supply chain to the point where it must choose between strategic compromise or industrial strain. At this level, power is no longer defined by territorial control. It is defined by control of flow. In this framework, sea lanes are no longer neutral transit routes. They are instruments of leverage. And if this trajectory holds, Washington will be positioned not merely to manage escalation, but to shape the global energy architecture on its own terms.